They thought it would be over in seconds. A duel, if it could even be called that. No, this was an execution. A show of power. A lesson carved into the very foundation of galactic dominance. The Zal-Exeth Dominion had never lost a war. For thousands of years, their empire had expanded relentlessly, crushing every civilization that dared to resist. Their warriors were engineered for perfection, genetically refined over countless generations, their biology sculpted to be weapons of war. The weak were culled. The strong were further enhanced. The elite among them became legends, towering figures draped in the weight of 1,000 victories. And among them, one name eclipsed all others: Carithus, a conqueror, a living weapon, a force of destruction so absolute that his mere presence on the battlefield shattered enemy morale before a single shot was fired. He was not simply a warrior. He was the Dominion's answer to defiance, their executioner, their god of war. And now, here, under the searing floodlights of the Colosseum Prime, he would demonstrate, once again, why resistance against the Zal-Exeth was futile. The human knelt at the center of the arena, hands bound in energy shackles, his head tilted downward. He was unremarkable at first glance, compact in frame compared to the monstrous forms of his captors, his body seemingly fragile, skin unmarred by the hardened plating or bio-armor of the Zal-Exeth warriors. He did not struggle. He did not beg. He simply knelt there, motionless, silent, as the crowd erupted in anticipation. Above them, the arena's force fields shimmered, sealing the combatants within. The air hummed with restrained power, charged with the anticipation of yet another inevitable slaughter. Carithus stood before his prey, towering, his armor shifting with a living pulse, dark and carapace-like, designed for war. His eyes glowed faintly, a predator evaluating its next kill. The blade in his grasp was a thing of nightmares, serrated and black, humming with the energy of 1,000 slain foes. The crowd knew this weapon well. They had seen it end lives, carve through entire legions like wind through sand. This was not a battle. It was a message. Let it begin. A shriek of metal as the bindings fell away. Carithus lunged. No ceremony, no hesitation. A blur of motion, his strike precise, monstrous in speed and force. The blade carved through the air with the intent to kill, to end. It should have been over, but it wasn't. The human moved. A flicker, too fast for the mind to register, too subtle for even the most trained eye to follow. The blade found only empty space, whistling through the air where flesh should have been. Carithus's feet slid against the arena floor, his balance momentarily shifting as he adjusted, confusion flickering in his expression. A heartbeat passed. And then, impact. A strike to his ribs. Precise. Calculated. Devastating. The sound was barely audible beneath the arena's deafening silence, but Carithus felt it. A sharp, focused impact that sent a ripple of pain through his torso, a sensation he had not experienced in centuries. His armor, a nearly indestructible fusion of organic plating and advanced kinetic absorption, had never been breached by anything less than high-yield explosives. Yet now, it had cracked. A ripple of uncertainty spread through the audience, a murmur of disbelief. Carithus straightened, his grip tightening on his blade, his predatory instincts roaring to life. Impossible. He had trained against the best, fought against creatures engineered for destruction, dueled with opponents capable of calculating 1,000,000 combat variables in real time. No species had ever outmaneuvered him, not like this. And yet the human stood before him, utterly unarmed. And worse, unshaken. Carithus exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that sent a deep tremor through his chest. He had underestimated his opponent. That would not happen again. His muscles coiled, his exoskeletal enhancements flaring to life. Energy surged through his limbs, increasing his speed, his power. The Colosseum's reinforced floors cracked under the force of his stance. This time, when he moved, he was no longer relying on technique alone. This time, he was bringing his full might to bear. A shockwave burst outward as he launched forward, his claws a blur, his strikes coming from every angle, unpredictable, overwhelming. The Dominion's way of combat was absolute. Brute force, calculated aggression, a relentless onslaught designed to break even the strongest defenses. And yet, nothing landed. The human moved, adapted, predicted. Carithus felt it happening, felt himself losing ground in a way that made no sense. His mind raced to analyze the data, to understand. But there was nothing to understand. No patterns, no predictability. His opponent fought like nothing he had ever encountered. The movements were erratic yet impossibly precise, shifting seamlessly between styles, reacting with an awareness that defied logic. It was not training. It was something else. Instinct. And that terrified him. He swung again, but this time he felt the mistake before it happened. The human didn't evade outright. Instead, he redirected. A subtle movement. A shift in weight. A motion so deceptively small that it made Carithus' own momentum work against him. He stumbled. Carithus, the champion of the Dominion, stumbled. The crowd gasped. A sound he had never heard before. Doubt. His own breath came heavier now. His vision flickered for the briefest moment as his body strained to compensate. No, this wasn't possible. The human took a single step forward. And Carithus, for the first time in his life, took a step back. The Zal-Exeth commanders watched from their high chamber, their expressions unreadable, their golden eyes narrowing as they studied the unfolding spectacle. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. A human, a primitive species, a lesser race, was standing toe-to-toe with their greatest warrior. But that wasn't the worst part. Carithus had studied thousands of combat forms. He had mastered every technique that war had to offer. And none of it mattered. The human was not following a strategy. He was reacting, learning. No species should have been able to do this, to adapt in real time against the finest warrior the Dominion had ever produced. But the human wasn't merely countering Carithus' attacks. He was evolving. And Carithus, god of war, master of death, executioner of worlds, was running out of time. Carithus was breathing heavily now. His pulse hammered through his temples, his vision narrowing, a thick sheen of sweat starting to form beneath his armored shell. He didn't notice it at first, but his hands were trembling. Something was wrong. For the first time in his life, Carithus found himself on the defensive. His body, a perfect weapon, the culmination of generations of genetic manipulation and advanced biomechanics, was beginning to falter. His strikes, once unstoppable, were missing their mark. His reflexes, honed through centuries of combat, were no longer enough. The human, this primitive, unmodified creature, was doing the impossible, not just surviving, but thriving. Each move, each shift in weight, every glance, every twitch of muscle was deliberate, calculated. It wasn't instinct alone. No, it was pattern recognition at an unprecedented level. The human's movements seemed to anticipate Carithus' every strike, as if it were studying him, not in the way a warrior would, but in a way that felt almost alien. The human had no weapons, no enhancements, no fighting style Carithus could analyze and break apart. There was no program or algorithm to predict the human's actions. There was no central command to follow. It was as if the human was in tune with the very fabric of the battle itself, able to sense the ebb and flow of combat on an instinctual, almost empathic level. This was something new, something the Dominion had never encountered before, something dangerous. Carithus took a step back, his boots grinding against the floor. His claws dug into the arena's metallic surface, sending out sparks of friction. He glared at the human, whose chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, a calmness beneath the chaos that sent a chill through Carithus' core. This wasn't fear. It wasn't bravado. It was something else. "You're not supposed to be here." The words were almost a growl, But the human didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly, almost as if in curiosity, his eyes locking with Carathis. There was no challenge there, no defiance, just quiet observation. Carathis snarled. Why wouldn't he beg? Why wouldn't he scream? Every species that had ever faced the Zal-Exeth had begged for mercy, pathetically weak, terrified. But this human, this fragile creature, stood tall, unyielding. The Zal-Exeth audience watched in stunned silence. This was not the spectacle they had come for. This was not the execution they had paid to see. They had expected death. Quick, clean, and final. Instead, they were witnessing something far worse. A slow unraveling of their greatest champion. The embodiment of their military might, struggling. Carathis' breathing became erratic, the frustration boiling within him. He had been in countless battles, fought across countless worlds, but nothing had ever prepared him for this. His mind raced, trying to adapt, to recalibrate his attack. His physical enhancements, once the pinnacle of warfare, were now a weakness. The more power he unleashed, the more vulnerable he became. The human had already proved he could read his moves, adapt. And now, Carathis was paying the price for it. In desperation, Carathis switched tactics. He launched forward again. But this time, his assault was not just physical. He used his aura, the intimidating presence of his being, the oppressive weight of his status as a god of war. The Zal-Exeth had perfected the art of psychological warfare, and Carathis had used it countless times to break the will of his enemies before a single blow was struck. But the human didn't flinch. No, this human wasn't intimidated. The human had no fear. There was no terror in his eyes, no hesitation, only an eerie calmness, as if he knew the truth Carathis had yet to realize, a truth about the nature of this battle and the nature of humankind itself. Carathis hesitated again. He had studied the human, his physiology, his history, his culture. He knew they were primitive, weak. They had evolved on a single world, in a single star system. Their technology was laughable by Dominion standards. And yet, here they were. Here he was. The realization hit Carathis like a crashing wave. This was not a warrior from an ancient, high-tech civilization like those the Zal-Exeth had crushed so effortlessly. This was a human, an untouched species that had never even begun to scratch the surface of the stars. And yet, in the arena of combat, they had something no advanced race could match: adaptability. Humans weren't just resilient. They were relentless in their ability to overcome, to adjust. Every setback was an opportunity to learn, to evolve, to improve. Where other species fought according to their doctrine, their codes, their predefined tactics, humans fought with a kind of wild ingenuity, a refusal to be shackled by rules. They weren't bound by tradition. They weren't limited by experience. They were free, unpredictable, like the very chaos of the universe itself. Carathis had never considered this, evolution on the fly. The thought that the human species had no specific blueprint to follow, that they could reshape themselves based on the situation at hand, was an alien concept to him. It was something the Dominion had never prepared for, because they had never needed to. This battle was not a test of strength. It was a test of adaptability. And Carathis, no matter how powerful, no matter how skilled, was realizing he was at a severe disadvantage. How could he defeat something that became stronger the longer the fight continued? The human stepped forward once more, his movements flowing with a grace that belied the sheer violence of their encounter. And for the first time, Carathis felt the deep bite of uncertainty. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shame. It was the crushing awareness that he was, in this moment, no longer in control. The arena's force barriers hummed, and the crowd held their breath. They watched as the greatest warrior of their people, Carathis, took another step back, retreating in the face of an enemy he could not understand, let alone defeat. And as the battle raged on, Carathis realized something even more terrifying. He was not facing a human. He was facing humanity, the relentless, unyielding spirit of a species that would never back down. And that was something the Dominion could never destroy. Carathis was no longer fighting as a warrior. He was fighting for survival. He could feel it now, the creeping sense of inadequacy gnawing at him with every passing second. His body, a machine designed to obliterate, to conquer, was starting to fail him. He could hear the grinding of his own joints, the unnatural strain of his muscles as his biological enhancements flared and then sputtered out of control. He could feel the rage bubbling beneath his calm exterior, the same rage that had served him so well in countless wars. But this was different. This human, this singular being, was not fighting to win. The human was simply existing in the fight, moving through it with an unsettling ease that made no sense. Every time Carathis struck, the human adapted, weaving through the onslaught with an agility that no engineered warrior could replicate. And the more Carathis tried to overpower him, the more the human seemed to learn, to improve. It was as though the very concept of strength was irrelevant. The arena was a blur of motion now, the echo of Carathis' frantic blows filling the air, each strike landing not on flesh, but on air. The human was faster, more agile than any foe Carathis had ever encountered. It wasn't that he was outclassed, he was outthought. And that realization clawed at Carathis' mind, unraveling him, stripping away the certainty that had once defined his every move. His confidence, once so absolute, was slipping away like sand through his fingers. Carathis had always believed that domination was the only language worth speaking. He had lived by it, fought by it, destroyed by it. And in the Zalak-Seth Dominion, where every action was calculated, every plan executed with military precision, the outcome of any conflict was always predictable. They had crushed billions of lives under the weight of their superior tactics, their relentless might. But here, now, on this forsaken world in front of this human, the rules had changed. The truth settled in with the cold, brutal weight of reality. The Zalak-Seth had never truly fought an enemy that did not share the same laws of warfare. Humans had no doctrine to follow, no creed to uphold. They were not bound by the same rituals of war. They fought with a terrifying wild energy, untamed, unbound by tradition or expectation, and that made them unpredictable, unbeatable. The humans' movements were a fluid mix of confusion and calculation, hesitation and precision. It was as if every move, every twist of the body, carried the weight of countless lifetimes. The human wasn't just adapting, it was evolving in real time. Carathis' strikes, once so flawless, were now met with a response that seemed not only natural, but instinctive. For a moment, Carathis hesitated, his mind stumbling to process this new information. The human was not following any patterns. It was as though the very fabric of combat was being bent by the human's presence, reshaped in the heat of battle. It wasn't intelligence alone. It was something else, something deeper. Then it hit him. Survival. Humans didn't just fight to win. They fought to survive. They weren't confined by the brutal logic of combat. They fought for something more primal, more instinctual than victory or honor. They fought because it was in their nature to never stop. No matter how many times they fell, no matter how many wars they lost, humans would always rise again. This was not a fight for dominance. It was a fight for existence. Carathis staggered backward as the human, his human opponent, closed the distance. The human didn't strike. It simply moved, placing one foot after the other in a steady, unbroken rhythm. Carathis' pulse quickened, his vision narrowing. He swung wildly, desperate to end it. But the human sidestepped, moving with an ease that made Carathis' strikes feel sluggish, calculated only by the slowness of his own perception. This was no longer a fight. It was a revelation. Every attack Carathis launched, every cut of his blade, was met with the human's uncanny ability to simply survive. And each time, Carathis found himself further out of control, His strikes became more desperate, his movements more erratic. His body screamed for release, for escape from the impossibility of what he was facing. The harder he pushed, the more exhausted he became. In his mind, Carethus had only known victory. His body had been honed for war, for destruction, for eliminating enemies with cold, scientific precision. But now, against this human, he was learning something new, that nothing in his training had prepared him for a true survivor. Every moment that passed, Carethus's grasp on his composure weakened. The realization that he might not win, might not survive, began to sink into his very bones. This human, this singular force of nature, was the epitome of what Carethus had never understood. Humans were not great because they were born with power. They were great because they could never be defeated. Carethus was suddenly struck by the image of thousands of human soldiers scattered across their barren worlds, fighting wars they could never win, fighting for a future that might never come. He had never thought of it like this before, and that was what terrified him. The human wasn't fighting because it believed it could win. It fought because it had no other choice. It had to fight. It had to survive. And there, in that simple truth, lay a power that Carethus could not understand, could not counter. It was a force that transcended logic, a force that Carethus had never encountered in his centuries of conquest. His mind reeled as he tried to comprehend the magnitude of the situation. He had faced countless enemies, seen civilizations reduced to ashes, watched countless warriors fall before him. But this was different. This was not about power. It was about resilience. The human paused, not to rest, but to observe Carethus. Its eyes, deep, calculating, yet calm, locked onto him, as though it was waiting for him to do something, to make a mistake. And in that moment, Carethus knew that he had already made his mistake. He had underestimated humanity. A flicker of doubt, like a shadow, passed across his mind, and for a fraction of a second, Carethus wasn't sure if he could win. It wasn't just the human anymore. It was humankind, and Carethus didn't know if even his unparalleled strength could ever defeat that. The arena was a silent expanse, the energy in the air crackling with tension. Carethus could feel the weight of the crowd pressing in on him, the silent, suffocating expectation that had once fueled his strength now turning into a heavy burden. Their roars had faded, their cheers nothing more than background noise against the growing realization that he, Carethus, the greatest warrior of the Zal-Exeth dominion, might actually lose this battle. The human hadn't spoken. In fact, it hadn't made a sound beyond the rhythmic tapping of its feet, the quiet swish of fabric against muscle. The only noise was the heavy breathing of Carethus and the faint hum of the energy shields flickering in the background. For all its primitive appearance, the human seemed to understand something Carethus could not fathom. Silence was as much a weapon as anything in the arsenal of combat. Carethus's eyes narrowed, and his grip tightened around the hilt of his blade. The human's presence seemed to warp the very air around them, bending reality in ways Carethus couldn't explain. It wasn't the blade's edge that had him questioning everything. It was the human's calm, the absence of fear, the absence of the animal terror that should have overtaken a lesser creature facing such overwhelming odds. The human was standing before him, unarmed, unenhanced, and yet in a way that made Carethus feel the stark realization. He was no longer in control. In all his years of training, in all the battles he had fought, Carethus had never known an opponent like this. He had faced entire civilizations that had raised themselves to dust under his fury. But this human, this lone creature, was doing the impossible. It wasn't just surviving. It was learning. The way it dodged his attacks with fluid precision was no longer random. It wasn't luck or coincidence. It was understanding. Each time Carethus moved, the human reacted with a shift in its posture, an almost imperceptible change in the angle of its body. It wasn't just reading his physical movements. It was reading him. Carethus was the weapon designed for destruction, honed over countless millennia. And yet he was finding himself outmatched by something far more elusive: the human's ability to adapt. For the first time in his career, Carathis realized that the greatest strength he had ever known was a weakness. His mind, so calculated, so efficient, was built on patterns. He dominated through knowledge and understanding of his enemy's strategies, their fears, their weaknesses. He read the battlefield like an open book, and in that book, the ending was always the same. But the human had no rules. It had no script to follow. It didn't play by the game Carathis had spent centuries perfecting. And that was where Carathis faltered. The human didn't react according to his expectations. Instead, it created its own rules. It learned, it evolved, and in doing so, it blurred the line between combat and survival. Carathis's vision swam with the growing fatigue. His limbs were growing heavier, each movement more sluggish than the last. His enhanced musculature, designed to outperform any organic being, was still failing him. He could feel the overheating of his internal systems, the constant hum of energy reserves running dangerously low. He had been pushing himself for too long, his calculations running out of steam, his body threatening to give way to the exhaustion he had never been forced to face. The human, on the other hand, was not slowing down. There was no sign of the weariness that should have been setting in. No indication that the strain of combat, the weight of the blows, the sheer physical toll of the battle was even affecting it. In fact, the human was becoming more fluid with each passing moment. Its movements, once disjointed and reactive, had grown smoother, more confident, more precise. Carathis had been right to recognize that this human was evolving on the fly, but what he had missed was the realization that this wasn't just a matter of adaptation. It was a matter of persistence. Carathis had been trained to believe that endurance was irrelevant. A battle should be finished swiftly, decisively. Every victory was a result of force, not time. The longer the fight dragged on, the more likely it was that the warrior in control would emerge victorious. But this one human was proving him wrong. This human wasn't just trying to survive, it was trying to endure. It was playing a different game altogether, one of time. And as the realization dawned on Carathis, a cold knot formed in his stomach. The human wasn't just waiting for a mistake. It was waiting for him to break. Carathis had been taught to think that the greatest warriors were those who crushed their enemies in a single, overwhelming strike. He had been taught to believe that the longer the fight stretched out, the more it worked in his favor. But he had never encountered an enemy that wasn't trying to defeat him quickly, that wasn't trying to win through sheer strength and power. The human wasn't operating on that logic. The human had no intention of crushing him. It only needed to keep going, keep pushing, keep surviving. Every small movement, every inch of space gained, was a victory in its own right. The human wasn't fighting to defeat Carathis. It was fighting to make sure he could never win. Carathis's mind raced. His heartbeat quickened, but not from adrenaline. It was from a realization, one that cut deeper than any wound. The Zelek Seth had always conquered through overwhelming power, through sheer force. But power was a tool, and tools could be broken. The human didn't rely on power, it relied on resilience, and that resilience could never be destroyed, because it was not bound by the rules of war or the laws of physics. The human was a force of nature. And in the arena, surrounded by the hushed silence of the audience, Carathis knew the most terrifying truth of all. He was no longer fighting to win. He was fighting to escape. The tides of the battle had shifted irrevocably, and there was no turning back. The ground beneath Carathis's feet trembled, as though the very planet itself was shaking in response to the conflict unfolding. His mind was a blur of chaos, processing the impossibility of his situation, while his body, once an unstoppable engine of destruction, was now a fragile vessel, struggling to keep up. The human, still standing before him, its expression unreadable, had become something far more dangerous than just an opponent. It had become a force of nature. Carathis tried to focus, to ground himself in the tactics that had served him through hundreds of campaigns, But his thoughts were disjointed, fragmented. Every time he tried to rationalize the fight, his thoughts slipped through his fingers like dust in the wind. Why wasn't it over? That was the question that haunted him, that clawed at the edges of his consciousness. This should have been a simple confrontation. He was the superior warrior. He was the hunter, and the human should have been the prey. But that was the mistake he had made from the beginning. He had underestimated the human's strength. The human hadn't moved in what felt like an eternity. It wasn't gloating, nor was it growing fatigued. It was simply waiting. Waiting for Carathis to make another move, waiting for him to break. It understood something that Carathis couldn't comprehend. The real power in this battle wasn't the speed of the strikes, the sharpness of the weapons, or the technology that powered their respective bodies. The real power was in the ability to endure, to persist against an unstoppable force with nothing more than sheer will. The Zalak-Seth had always relied on their superior technology, their genetically engineered warriors, their mastery of the battlefield. But this human, it was not bound by the same rules. It was not restricted by the limitations of advanced weaponry or the constraints of biological engineering. The human had something else, something that Carathis couldn't fathom, a vitality, a refusal to be anything less than alive. Carathis' breathing grew ragged, the air thick and stifling, as though the weight of the atmosphere itself was closing in on him. He could feel the heat building inside his body, the energy reserves dwindling with every passing second. His enhanced muscles, once capable of feats beyond any natural creature, now screamed in protest. The steady hum of his internal systems, which had once been a comforting presence, now felt like the ticking of a bomb, a reminder of how much time he had left. And yet, despite everything, the human was still there, still waiting, still watching. Carathis' mind raced through his options, but there were no options left. Every strategy, every maneuver, every trick he had ever known had been countered. The human had adapted faster than he could think. His greatest strength, his ability to outsmart, outmaneuver, and overpower, had become his greatest weakness. The human's adaptability had taken that away from him. The realization hit him harder than any blow could. It wasn't enough to be powerful. Power meant nothing when faced with someone who could endure longer than you. Strength was irrelevant against an enemy who knew how to outlast you. Carathis' mind flickered to the long history of the Zalak-Seth dominion. They had conquered countless civilizations, driven entire species to the brink of extinction, because they had never encountered an enemy like this. Each planet they had conquered had been brought to its knees by the sheer force of their military might. The Zalak-Seth believed in the concept of absolute superiority. They had believed in the infallibility of their own strength. And yet here, in this forsaken arena, it was failing. The human was still standing. Carathis' hand tightened around his weapon, but it was no longer the unshakable grip of a conqueror. It was the desperate grasp of a dying being, clinging to the last shred of their power. He was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted. The human shifted. Just a slight movement, a subtle step forward. But that was enough. It was no longer just waiting. It was attacking. The air seemed to warp around the human as it moved, impossibly fast, too fast for Carathis to react. His vision blurred as he swung his blade, but the human was already gone, its body a blur of motion, a reflection of something deep and primal. A sound, sharp, piercing, ripped through the air. The human had struck, and Carathis' mind barely processed the blow before the pain registered. His side burned, an agony that felt foreign, alien, the sharp sting of something real, something human. He stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart thundering in his chest. He could feel the energy reserves flickering, a dying ember struggling against the weight of his failure. His mind raced, but there was no strategy left. There was no escape. The human had him now, and the worst part was that Carathis knew it. The human had won, not with superior strength, but with a strength Carathis had never known. a strength that came not from weaponry or enhancements, but from resilience. In that moment, Carathis felt something he had never felt before. Fear. But it wasn't the kind of fear he was used to. The kind of fear that came from facing an opponent, stronger, faster, more skilled. No, this fear was something far more terrifying. It was the fear of inadequacy, the fear of realizing that his strength, his power, his entire existence as a warrior was nothing more than a facade. It was the fear of confronting the simple truth that he had never been the strongest. Humans were. The human, now standing just a few feet away, did not move in for the kill. It simply observed, the quiet calm of its gaze cutting deeper than any blade ever could. There was no rush. No need to end this quickly. The human had all the time in the universe. And Carathis, the greatest warrior in the galaxy, realized he was powerless. In that silence, he understood what had always been the greatest weapon of humanity. They never needed to win. They just needed to survive. The world seemed to slow around Carathis. The pain in his side throbbed in time with his heartbeat, each pulse a reminder of how vulnerable he had become. His vision blurred, his energy reserves dwindling. And yet, despite it all, the human remained poised, calm, and unmoving. It was as if the battle had shifted entirely, no longer a contest of strength, but a test of endurance, and Carathis was failing. He had fought countless enemies, defeated armies, torn through civilizations. His reputation had been built on the assumption that nothing could stand against the sheer force of his will. But now, facing this lone human, everything he had ever known about combat, about what it meant to be the strongest, was crumbling to dust. He staggered back, attempting to right himself, but his legs felt heavy, his body unresponsive, as though every cell was screaming for release. The human stillness, its deliberate lack of motion, was the most terrifying thing Carathis had ever faced. It wasn't just surviving, it was waiting. Waiting for him to break, waiting for him to exhaust his last reserves, waiting for him to realize that it was no longer a matter of strength or power, it was a matter of time. The human took another step forward, and this time it was not in aggression, but in simple, deliberate movement, a deliberate challenge. Carathis's eyes locked onto the human's, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of something else, something primal and foreign. It was as though the human's very presence was speaking to him, whispering something deep inside that he couldn't understand. There was no arrogance in its gaze, no triumph. There was simply a truth that stung harder than any weapon. The truth was that Carathis had always relied on an old, outdated idea of combat, one where the strongest, the fastest, the deadliest was the victor. But the human was not fighting this way. The human didn't need to be faster or stronger. It had learned to live without the need for instant victory. It had learned how to fight in ways that Carathis could not begin to comprehend. There was something deep and insidious in that realization. The human was resilient, a quality that could not be engineered, a quality that could not be beaten with any weapon. This, Carathis understood now, was not simply a battle of physical strength. This was a battle of willpower. The human's greatest weapon was not its body, but its mind, its soul, and its unwavering resolve to live. It was the human's persistence that had begun to undo him. The longer the fight dragged on, the more Carathis felt the tension, the pressure, the weight of his own limitations. He had always seen himself as a superior being, the pinnacle of his species' military prowess. But now, standing face to face with this human, he realized how fragile that belief was. The human spoke then, its voice low but carrying, a quiet ripple in the charged air. You're not the first to think strength equals victory, but you're the first to see it fail. Carathis's heart skipped a beat. The words themselves weren't a challenge. They were a statement, a simple truth, delivered without malice. It was as though the human had known all along that this battle wasn't about beating him. It was about outlasting him. The words echoed in Carathis's mind, their meaning settling in like a slow, sinking weight. He had been blind, to what truly mattered in a fight. Strength had always been the answer, but now it felt like the wrong question. He had been taught that only the strongest could conquer, but the human, standing before him, had shown him otherwise. The human had shown him that there was another path, one that didn't require defeating the opponent but simply outliving them. Carithus gritted his teeth, the sting of humiliation sharp against his growing awareness. His body was failing him, but his mind was still sharp. He had one last chance, one final weapon he could wield before he collapsed completely. His intellect. He had to think his way out of this, had to find a solution that could shatter the impasse they had reached. But the human was still waiting. It wasn't advancing, it wasn't pressing the attack. It was standing there, watching him, patient. And in that waiting, Carithus saw the very thing that had brought him to the brink. The human wasn't just enduring the battle, it was playing the long game. The human had not just adapted to his attacks, it had made him adapt to its own strategy. And that strategy, Carithus realized with a sickening clarity, was not about defeating him in the short term. It was about making him defeat himself. The human understood that the real weapon in any battle wasn't the strength of the blows, but the mind. And that was why Carithus was losing. His thoughts raced, but his body wasn't responding. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to his knees, the sheer weight of his own exhaustion dragging him down. He couldn't keep up with the human's rhythm, the steady, deliberate pace that had now overtaken him. His vision swam, the edges of his perception dimming as if the very atmosphere was closing in around him. The world felt smaller now, quieter. But even as he knelt there, broken, humiliated, he couldn't help but wonder, had the human known this all along? Had the human understood from the very beginning that it was never about the strength of the attack? That it was never about the ability to crush and destroy? The realization came too late. The human had been playing him from the start. And in this game of endurance, Carithus had never stood a chance. The human stood silently in front of him, its gaze unwavering. And Carithus felt something shift deep within himself. He had fought so hard, for so long, to be the apex predator, to be the greatest warrior. But now, faced with the sheer resilience of this human, he could only see one thing. He had underestimated humanity's most dangerous trait, the will to survive. And that was the greatest power of all. Carithus had fallen. His once imposing figure, once the symbol of absolute might, was now crumpled on the unforgiving surface of the alien world. The air was still, a heavy silence settling over the battlefield, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. The human, now looming above him, did not rush forward to deliver the final blow. There was no need for theatrics, no need for a dramatic finish. The battle had already been decided. Carithus' eyes were still clouded with confusion, the shock of his defeat lingering like a bitter taste in his mouth. He had fought with everything he had. And yet, here he was, on his knees, humiliated, broken. The realization was a weight that pressed upon him like a collapsing star. He, the greatest warrior the Galactic had ever produced, had been bested by a human. A mere human. The human had done what no other species had ever managed. It had not defeated him in a single decisive moment. Instead, it had worn him down, exploited his every weakness, and forced him to confront the very limitations of his existence. The human's victory had not come from power. It had come from endurance, patience, and a depth of will Carithus could not comprehend. As he lay there, the taste of defeat still bitter on his tongue, Carithus wondered, what had gone wrong? He had been trained from the moment he could hold a weapon, taught that the galaxy was his to conquer. The Galactic were a people born of war, their entire civilization built on the principle of strength through dominance. He had never questioned this ideology. Why would he? His victories had spoken for themselves. The enemies he had faced fell before him like wheat before the scythe. But now, with the weight of this human's unwavering gaze on him, he felt as though everything he had believed was nothing more than a fragile illusion. The human crouched down to his level, its eyes cold, calculating, but not with malice. Carithus could feel its presence radiating an unspoken understanding. The human had known all along that this was not a fight for survival, but for resilience. It had never been about defeating the strongest. It had always been about outlasting the inevitable exhaustion that came from being overpowered by a greater force. The human had turned his very strength against him, forcing him to waste his energy, forcing him to expend everything in pursuit of an unreachable victory. Carithus' breath slowed, his mind racing through the final moments of the fight, trying to find the turning point, the moment when everything had shifted. He had been in control, confident in his superiority, when the human had shifted the battlefield in an instant. The moment the human had realized the battle was not about strength but endurance, it had become unbeatable. That was the mistake Carithus had made. He had treated the human as an equal in terms of physical prowess, failing to grasp the most dangerous aspect of all, the human's mind. "Why didn't you just finish it?" Carithus rasped, his voice weak, barely a whisper. The human's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, more a subtle acknowledgement of something Carithus could never have understood before. "Because, Carithus," the human said, its voice calm but filled with a quiet certainty, "this was never about defeating you. It was about showing you that your greatest weapon was never your strength. It was always your will." The words lingered in the air like an ancient truth, something Carithus had never fully understood. In his arrogance, he had relied on the superiority of his physical power, his unassailable strength. But that had been his fatal flaw. The human had not needed power to win. The human had simply refused to give in. It had persisted, adapted, and in the end, Carithus had been forced to confront the unbearable truth. Strength is fleeting. Will is eternal. He had not lost because the human was stronger. He had lost because the human was more determined. Carithus could feel the energy draining from him, his body no longer able to hold up the weight of his humiliation. The world around him felt distant, as though his senses were fading. The human stood, watching him for a moment longer, before turning its back on him. There would be no mercy, no final blow. The human had already won, and Carithus knew that nothing could change the outcome now. But even as the cold emptiness of defeat began to wash over him, Carithus couldn't help but feel a strange sense of awe. The human had done what no other species had ever done. It had shown him the true cost of arrogance, the terrifying truth that even the greatest warriors could fall, not to a superior strength, but to a superior will. As the human walked away, Carithus closed his eyes, his breath shallow. The stars above him seemed to grow distant, like ancient witnesses to a forgotten history. He wondered for a moment how many others had faced this same realization, the humbling truth that strength was not enough. And with that thought, Carithus felt something else. Something new. It was a shift in perspective, the fragile seed of understanding that had sprouted within him. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to the universe than simply conquering. Perhaps there was more to life than strength. But the questions would remain unanswered for him. His journey had come to an end, and in the silence of the battlefield, the only thing left was the slow, inevitable march of time. Had humanity known this all along? Had they always understood that survival wasn't about the fight, but the perseverance through it? The answer, Carithus would never know. But the question would linger, hanging in the air, like a mystery too profound to unravel. And in that, Carithus realized that perhaps this was the true power of humanity, their ability to leave behind questions that would echo across the stars forever.